Breaker, breaker. That's a Roger, Roger. What's your vector, good people of the world? It's your friend of all frequencies, the Big Heavy, and today we're going to talk about installing two-way radios in the brand new 2021 Ford F-150. Now, this will be a pretty good video. I'm going to try and share how I've done my installation. I'll try and talk about some of the different options you have and different ways you can do things, some of the choices you have to make, and I'll try and show how I did some of the wiring and various things, since there don't seem to be a lot of videos out there about the new F-150 at this point. If this seems like something you're into, if you're kind of copying me 5x5, go ahead and key up that subscribe button down below. It'll help me avoid Smokey and the Bear and keep my rig on the road. So let's get into it. So when I talk about two-way radios, I'm kind of talking in general terms. In my specific case, we'll be talking about putting in a ham radio or amateur radio. In this case, it's a Yaesu FT400, which is a 2 meter and 70 centimeter radio. That doesn't mean anything to you. Just, think ham radio, think radio nerds and old men and that sort of thing. I'll talk about some of the applications of that a little later. And I'm also putting in a Midland GMRS radio. I'll put links to both those down below if you want to check them out. I realize some of you that are a little hip to the radio scene will tell me that, yes, I can do all those frequencies on something like the Yaesu. Technically, it's our benevolent overlords at the FCC tell us you're not allowed to do that. So I have two radios, not just because I'm a goody two-shoes Boy Scout, but because it's appealing to have one as a backup, and also appealing to me to be able to operate on multiple frequencies. So why would you want to put two-way radios in your truck? So there's some obvious reasons. If you're a volunteer firefighter or some other public safety person that needs radios for your job, that's kind of the obvious one. If you're just a big dumb animal like me that doesn't have any of those responsibilities, there's still a few good reasons. So first of all, it's kind of nice if you're in a convoy, if road tripping with some other vehicles. In my case, that could be my wife, that could be my Boy Scout troop. I can give people a couple of GMRS handhelds and then talk to them through the rig on my truck. Especially if you've got more than one vehicle you're trying to talk to, it's a lot easier to do that via radio than trying to coordinate via cell phone and having to call people and do all that stuff. The other thing that's nice about it is you can let your truck kind of serve as a base station. So if you've got a radio in there, again, you can give the kids handhelds, let them run around camp. You could have people out on a hike or on a mountain biking trip and use your vehicle as a base station to communicate with those folks while they're out and about. Final couple things, there still are parts of this world, thankfully or unthankfully, depending on how you look at it, that don't have cell coverage. So having access to radios, particularly the 2 meter and ham stuff where you can access repeaters, it can give you some long distance communication capabilities, either just to stay in touch with folks, or if you get into a little bit of trouble and need to get in touch with somebody or make some sort of emergency contact. And finally, again, on the ham side of things, there's a function called APRS, which stands for Automatic Position Reporting System. It's kind of a neat way to see what's going on around you in terms of other vehicles that are in the vicinity, radio repeaters, weather, all that sort of stuff when you're off the grid and away from the internet. And I won't belabor that. That's something you can look up if you're interested. But having that 2 meter Yaesu radio allows me to access those capabilities. And finally, it's cool. I've always been fascinated by radio. I had a CB in my hand-me-down minivan when I was 16 and would tear ass around the suburbs, talking to my buddies, and found it moderately amusing. So in my old age, I'm reliving my youth and just rocking out with some radio action. Now, in terms of doing this yourself, I always like to try and kind of give you a lay of the land before you get into it. I would say the skill level needed for this, I'd put it between beginner and moderate. It's not anything complicated mechanically. Basically it's turning screws, operating wire strippers, goofing around a little bit in your car. The reason I'd kind of bump it up towards moderate is just, electricity always presents some risks. In this case, we're dealing with 12-volt systems, so there's a pretty low risk of death or something terrible, which you might get if you were dealing with high voltage household current stuff. But electricity kind of has its own set of concerns and worries. And also, you've got to be ready, in my case, to tear apart a car that's 2 weeks old. We're going to be taking some trim panels off. We're going to be getting under the hood. We're going to be goofing around a little bit, and that's always a little bit nerve-wracking. So if you can turn a screwdriver, if you kind of know 12-volt electrical systems, this will be a walk in the park for you. And probably the hardest part is figuring out where to put things, how to arrange things, and kind of finding out the lay of the land in a new vehicle that not many people have produced videos about how to take apart. The good news with the F-150 is the 2021 is not completely dissimilar to the 2020. So, if you want to watch a video on how to remove the headliner, it's exactly the same as far as I can tell. You know, a lot of the removing the rear seats, the upper part of the rear seat is the same as far as I can tell. So there is some helpful stuff out there, but did want to give some 2021 specific stuff. And finally, kind of the way we'll break this down, there's sort of 5 things you have to think about, and you have to think about them in terms of where am I going to install them, how am I going to connect them, what are the different considerations. And those 5 things are your antennas, where you're going to put the actual radios themselves. In my case, both of my radios, the radio part is separate from the display, which makes things nice, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But where are you going to put those radio bases? How are you going to run power to those radio bases, and some of the different considerations there. And then finally, where you're going to put the actual handheld mics that you end up talking on, and in my case, both those mics give you some control functions over channel and things like that. And then where you're going to put the display. In the case of my Midland GMRS radio, the display is built into the handheld. In the case of the Yaesu ham radio, the display is a separate unit, but it is separate from that base. So that gives you, in my opinion, a little more mounting flexibility at a trade-off for a little bit of additional cost. So first thing we're going to talk about is antennas. And there's a few trade-offs specifically with the F-150, and in general there's some things you have to think about when you're selecting antennas. And I'm not going to go into a ton of detail, mostly because I'm not smart enough to understand all the nuances of antenna selection. You know, if I were you, I would find a forum with radio nerds or people with your specific type of vehicle and radio and kind of find out what they use for an antenna. That's probably the easiest solution in the long run, and is basically what I did. So what I have on my specific vehicle is I have a third brake light antenna mount, which you can see up here. Pros of this are it's super cool looking, in my opinion. You know, it looks factory, fits right in there. It's you know, non-invasive. You're not drilling any holes in the vehicle. You're not causing any long-term changes to the vehicle. And in the case of my particular truck, I've got that big old sunroof on there. So dropping an antenna in the middle of the roof is probably not going to happen, or at least not happen in an effective way. So on the left side of the vehicle, I have a Comet dual band antenna. It's a 70 centimeter and 2 meter antenna. It's a whip antenna, so theoretically if I whack a tree, that should hopefully give me a little bend. It doesn't have a folding mechanism, which I thought it did based on the description in the catalog. So I may ultimately change this, because I think you could still go through a drive-through or hit some low-hanging trees, and I don't want to rip off or jack up that mount that's on there. On the GMRS side, I have a layered phantom antenna. So this guy's nice and small. I'm probably going to do something similar. There's a company called Compact Tenna that makes an antenna in this style for 2 meter and 70 centimeter that I think will be a little better than this whip antenna. Now this bulletproof mount, again, looks the business, looks pretty awesome. The big negative here is price. Kind of like all good things, this sucker is expensive. It's you know, pushes 400 bucks, so you kind of take it in the pants and hopefully chalk it up into one of those things that's a buy once, cry once kind of scenario. My thinking was, don't have to drill a hole in the roof, non-permanent, gets me up top on the vehicle, eliminates the issues with the aluminum roof that can be a problem for some antennas. So kind of worth the cost at the end, and they give you, in this case, 2 15-foot antenna cables to plug into your radio, so you get some flexibility if I ever do want to change the location where I mounted my radio. So moving to the inside of the vehicle, you can see I've lifted up the seats, and this is the same as the previous generation of F-150. I think the only thing that's new here is these bins, which fold flat and are an option, so you may or may not have these. But where I ultimately brought the antenna cables to, and where I'm going to put the radios, and I'll show you that in a few minutes, is behind the storage bin. And it's kind of unused space. You know, you could jam some jumper cables in there, or a first aid kit or something like that. But what I liked about this spot is it's out of the way. There's hopefully a little better airflow than sticking the radios somewhere like the glove compartment or in the front storage bin. And it you know, prevents you from having a crazy long antenna cable run. So these cables go up here, and then they come behind the rear seat. You can watch some videos on how you remove this rear seat. It's easy on the passenger side. The driver's side, it's a little bit goofy, but the procedure is the same for the previous generation. The one pro tip I'll give you is, if you fold this lower seat about halfway, you can get your hand behind this guy to get the latch much easier. So that's kind of the pro tip there. And what I did to get the antenna through is I didn't fully remove the headliner, but I was able to loosen it and get behind there. So Again, procedure's the same as the previous generation. Basically involves removing this coat hook, which is one torque screw, and then kind of removing this or loosening up this trim piece on the side. So this guy right here, that I was able to do by hand. You don't really need a trim tool or anything. And ultimately, when you get that space, you can kind of work this this headliner down a little bit. I will say it was pretty tough to get that headliner down. You know, the video I watched said you have to apply a good amount of force, and that was accurate. You know, it was kind of getting to that point where you're applying so much force you feel like you're going to break your new truck or crease the headliner, neither of which I wanted to do, obviously. So what I did was I was able to get 1 or 2 clips off, and without going crazy, jam kind of a screwdriver in between where the moonroof and the headliner meet, and that gave me enough of a gap so that I could feed the cables through. And my daughter helped me. She stood in the back of the truck and kind of fed those antenna cables through, and I was ultimately able to grab them and, using a coat hanger, kind of fish them over to this corner. So I fished them to the corner of this trim, and then, or the corner of the headliner, then ran them down through this trim piece and just kind of dropped them out the bottom of that trim piece behind this back seat. So I ran them back behind that trim piece and then ultimately brought the antenna cables down here where I'm going to put my radios. All right, let's talk power. Now, a few considerations you want to think about when you're running power. Basically, there's 3 options. Option 1 is you can tap into an existing circuit. So that could be something like your cigarette lighter, that could be an accessory where you can find 12-volt power. And the benefit of that is it's generally pretty easy. You know, there's already power there, it's already got fuses, it can be switched or unswitched depending on what circuit you want to tap in. So that's the prime benefit. The drawbacks are you're potentially putting a bit too big a load on a circuit other than what it was designed for. In modern vehicles, some different lines are for communications versus just 12-volt power, so you risk tapping into the wrong thing and messing up some element of your vehicle's function. That's generally not something that you want to do. You also end up having to use some power taps that, in my opinion, are kind of ugly, and sometimes you have to jam a bunch of unsightly power taps back into your vehicle somewhere, and that doesn't work too well. Option 2 is you can use what's called an add-a-fuse. So this is essentially a little device that looks like a fuse, has a little pigtailed wire running out of it. You jam it in your fuse panel and you've got yourself a new circuit. Now, you may be tapping into an existing circuit, you may be tapping into one of the unused circuits in your vehicle. Sometimes you have those. If there's an option you didn't order, manufacturers will generally leave a couple or 3 extra spots in the fuse block that you can use. Not a bad option. Negatives are you've got to run some more wire than if you were tapping a circuit that was kind of local to where you were installing something. You know, again, it's still not 100% solution in terms of just effectiveness, in terms of affecting your vehicle's standard functionality. So in my case, I chose to tap directly into the battery, run a line from the battery back to behind the seat where I'm putting my radios in. And the benefits of that approach are I have my own new circuit, I'm not affecting anything that's existing. If there's a problem with the radios, it shouldn't affect anything else in the vehicle, and it should be relatively easy to debug. And by virtue of using that fuse block, I now have 4 extra spaces to add additional accessories at some point. So I could put in something like bed lights, running lights, camp lights, you know, anything I could possibly think of. And it runs directly off the battery, so I can leave that on however long I want if I'm using my radios in kind of a base station capacity. Negative there, of course, is that you need to remember to turn them off. Although a radio just in receive mode shouldn't use too much power, if you left both those on for a week or 2, you might end up with a dead battery, which is obviously a bad thing. Let's talk about how you go and install a new 12-volt circuit. In my case, since I'm running to a fuse block, I want to go directly to the battery. And the pro tip there, aside from getting a lovely lemon themed tablecloth at your parents' house, is to use a stereo amplifier installation kit. I'll link to this specific kit that I got. It's generic Chinese thing from the fabulous world of Amazon. But what they give you, and I'm only going to use about half this stuff, is a nice long 12-volt cable that's got an inline fuse holder close to the battery. You can see I've removed this big honking fuse because when I'm installing this, I don't want to have any power going through there. They give you a nice ground wire, and they give you some other miscellaneous car audio related stuff that I'm not going to use, as well as some zip ties and some spade clips and things like that. But it was way cheaper than anything else I could find for a long run of reasonably thick wire to take back to a fuse box. I think it was like 20 bucks. And a lot of the other stuff I looked at, I was gonna have to hack together a cable and do some goofy stuff, and it was 30, 40 bucks in materials. So this is a pretty good way to get the setup you need if you want to go direct to the battery. So basically what you're ultimately trying to accomplish is to get power from here, from your battery, particularly that nice red positive terminal there, back to wherever you're going to put your radios. Again, in my case, under that seat. So what generally you need to do is connecting to the batteries fairly easy. The only consideration, and we'll talk about that a little more later, is you want to have a fuse in your wire close to the battery, which that amp installation kit nicely comes with and provides. But the magic trick is getting through the firewall. The firewall is, you can kind of see in there, that silver part of the vehicle which separates the engine, where the fire is, coincidentally, from the passenger side of the vehicle. And usually the manufacturer will have some inbuilt penetrations. So in our case, it just so happens the F-150 has a nice little penetration, if I can get to it. There's a nice little penetration down there where you can see that wiring harness kind of running through next to that large silver object. And what I've done, if you can see it in there, and we'll try from the inside of the vehicle, is use the universal professional installation tool for all things wiring, also known as a coat hanger. So I cut a little piece of coat hanger off. I used a utility knife and tried to score as best I could that rubber down there. It's pretty thick, but got a little bit of a hole in there and jammed that piece of coat hanger that you can see. If you can't see it, let's take a little trip into the vehicle. So hopefully it's a little dark in there, I realize, but you can see. So hopefully with the aid of the flashlight, you can kind of see where I've poked that coat hanger through. And the nice thing about using a coat hanger, you don't make too big a hole if you miss. You know, obviously you want to be a little bit careful and try and make sure you put that through where you're intending to put it through. But in my case, I'm pretty happy with that. All right, so I finally got this guy through. You know, this is one of these aspects of any job. You can see kind of how it came through that grommet there, hopefully. All right, so I'm almost there. You can see I've kind of laid my cable about where I'm going to want it ultimately. Yeah, I'm gonna zip tie it probably along this, I think that's the intercooler hose. You know, follow along with some other wiring down here and zip tie it in there and kind of keep it nice and neat. Don't want a ton of slack, but I've left myself a little slack at this point. And kind of pull that through the firewall, and I'll show you how things are looking inside at the moment. So I took off that nice platinum trim piece. You can kind of see the little clips there. Again, it's something you can do with your hands. You don't really need a trim tool or anything. Just be nice and careful. I started from the top and was just gentle, kind of used both hands, gave it a little gentle pry, and got those 4 or 5 clips to unlatch. Then unhook the ones at the bottom, kind of same deal, and you know, just was able to pop up this trim piece up here. You know, same thing's going to happen on that trim piece up there, and you can see there's this nice existing wire channel that I'm going to run this guy through. And what I kind of did for now is basically just lay out kind of where my cable's going to run. So I'm going to do the same thing back here, pop up those trim panels, get that cable back there. But I've kind of got it back here. I can see that I've got about enough room. Yeah, this was a 16-foot kit. I don't think you could do it assuming you want to install back under the seats with anything shorter. So I'd go for the 16 if you're thinking about this. And now I'm going to make that battery connection. Again, I've removed my fuse from this new 12-volt cable, so once I get that hooked up, there won't be any power running through this cable. I won't be in danger of shorting anything out if this touches metal while I'm doing the rest of my install. So that's the next step for the power piece of the equation. All right, so I've got my 12-volt line hooked up. Key thing to remember when working in vehicle 12-volt systems, you know, there's not enough. Let me take that back. I don't want to say something that's absolutely incorrect because electricity can always kill you. But generally, when you're working with AC, there's enough current that you, as a big bag of bones and water, can serve as a conductor. So you do something wrong when you're dealing with high voltage household current. The electricity will go through your arms and through your heart and do terrible things to you, including, I've heard, essentially burning your heart and lungs and cardiovascular system as the current travels through you. So nasty stuff. Thankfully, there's a lot less risk to 12-volt systems. The key is to be smart. When I hooked that ring terminal onto the battery It was a simple process. Where things could have gotten nasty is if I was using a metal wrench. If that metal wrench touched something else metal, that would obviously complete a circuit. Batteries do have enough current that I've heard of people, if they touch a wrench to a piece of metal while working on a battery, I've heard of them getting it welded to the frame. At a bare minimum, you'll see a spark show. You may get a little tingle from the electricity, so just be super careful. And if you don't feel comfortable with this or anything in this video, obviously don't do it. I'm not recommending that you do it. I'm not a professional. I'm just some jabroni on the internet. So do all this at your own risk. Don't blame me if you get zapped or bust up your car or anything like that. But just if you are going to do something like this, again, at your own risk, be careful, be cautious, be safe, and it's not a super difficult procedure. So now that I've got that power line hooked up, again, there's no fuse in there, so I don't run any risk of potentially shorting out anything if that metal in the red wire touches anything while I'm running it through the vehicle. I'm going to zip tie that in the engine bay, pick up any slack to where I'm happy with how it looks in the engine bay, pull any slack through that firewall, and then start to run the cable into its final position. Then I'm going to mount my radio board, hook up power to that, find a ground back there. Apparently there is a factory ground point back there that I'll hook up the ground wire to, and then I'll be set. And just a note on grounding, if you're not super familiar with 12-volt vehicle systems, you may think, how are you running this gigantic long positive wire to the battery but not doing anything about the negative side? For the most part, the vehicle chassis, so all the metal in there, serves as a ground. There usually are factory provided ground points where they'll scrape away the paint and make sure that you've got a good electrical connection, which is always a good thing when dealing with anything audio related. If you have a bad ground, you may introduce noise into the system, it may sound a little funky. So ideally you want to use a factory ground point. I believe there is one back there, which we'll take a look for once we get the back of the seat off and start goofing around back there. All right, so you can see where we've run our ground. So there's this little gap in this felt sheet back here. So basically just pull that back a little, enough to get to this factory ground point. And the only problem I had was the grommet that was supplied with the amplifier kit. The hole was a little too small, so I had to kind of ream that out. Didn't really have the right tools for it. Used a drill, which, yes, is not the proper path, but hey, sometimes desperate times call for desperate measures. So let me close this up and I'll show you what it looks like with it closed up. So here's our radio board set up, and as you can see, just a simple piece of plywood. Got my two radios mounted on there. The one on the right is my 2 meter and 70 centimeter ham radio. In the middle is the Midland GMRS radio. And then both of these get power through a fuse block. Nothing too magical here, but this will take power from the battery. And essentially, those two big screws on the top and bottom is the power from the battery, and then the ground at the bottom, which I'll run to an existing vehicle ground. And it gives you one place to have a whole bunch of fuses that ultimately power your devices. Don't be like me when I was a teenager, where I just twist the wires together and jam them out of the screw, put some ring terminals on, or some spade connectors on there. Sorry, not ring terminals. Makes it neat, makes it nice. Make sure you don't get strands flying off and shorting things. This is a fuse block I'll put down in the link, got from Amazon. Theoretically, these little red lights on there will turn on if the fuse is dead, which is kind of cool. I only essentially have 2 fuses active, but put a bunch in there as spares. And then I basically clipped the harnesses, the wiring harnesses that came with the radio. The Yaesu ham radio had wires that just ended in bare terminals, but they were a good 10 feet long, so clipped that. The Midland radio had a wiring harness that ended in a cigarette lighter or vehicle power adapter, so just cut that off. Left myself a little bit of slack there. You can see that's kind of bundled in there, just in case in the future if I want to do something else and need to extend those cables. And I use some zip ties to kind of neaten things up. Some people are anti-zip tie and prefer Velcro. You do you. I think the only thing you have to be careful with zip ties is sometimes these ends will be a little sharp, and in a vehicle environment where you're bouncing around, could potentially rub against something, chafe some wire, and or cause some problems. So that's essentially the radio board that kind of keeps everything together for me. And ultimately, if there's a problem or I need to take it out for a vehicle for whatever reason, I can just drop that right out and repair, modify, move to a different vehicle, whatever. All right, so here we are all wired up, and man, if I could have used an extra foot on the power cable, because you're going to be able to see it out of this little corner, which, you know, I would have liked to have taken it all the way back and been able to run it behind the seat so you wouldn't see it. I could use an extra 6 inches on the ground cable. So I'm going to link to something that hopefully has those extra cables. You know, this power cable was theoretically 16 feet. I think it was exactly like 15 foot 8, just because of the metric conversion. So even that extra 4 inches could have it maybe got me where I need to be. But I'll see if I can link a kit that's got, you know, an 18-foot cable and probably a 4-foot ground cable would be perfect. It'd give you a little room for slack, a little room in case you goof something up. And maybe someday, somewhere, I'll replace these, but someday is not today. But that's all wired up. We've got fused power to each of our radios, which is kind of cool. You can see over there. And we've got the antennas hooked up. Next job is to run the display for the Yaesu and the display and mic for the Yaesu, and just the mic for the Midland, since his display is essentially on the mic. So that'll save us a cord, which will be kind of nice, all things considered. So part of these types of projects is willing to be a little creative, and in my case I have this grand plan of running my microphone and display cables up through the same nice channel in the door sill where the power cables are, going up under the steering column and then coming into the center console. Grand idea, but my cables are a little too short, and I already have one extension on the Midland mic/display cable. I don't know if I want to add an extension for the display for the Yaesu. I do have a Yaesu mic extension cable coming later today. So, and I also didn't want to get things that were running too tight, especially with wires going under the steering column. If one of those fall down and you get your foot tangled in that wire, it prevents you from hitting the gas or the brake or something like that. Obviously very, very bad things can happen. So in terms of getting like a little creative, what I did was essentially run the wires to where I wanted. I put the Midland mic in the little side pocket near your right leg as you drive. Haven't really found a use for that yet, and there's plenty of storage in the truck, so don't really think I'll lose much there. It's just kind of laying there for now, and when I use it I pop it up and drop it in the little space where the shifter goes. I might put a little mic clip on there. We'll kind of see how things go for use-wise. And I put the cable for the display for the Yaesu sort of where it is. I don't have the cup holder mount for that yet. But then essentially just ran it under the carpet and was able to tuck it into the little perimeter around the fold-away seat thing in the back. So relatively hidden when the carpet goes down, yet fairly convenient, and I don't need those extra extension cables. So here's to creativity. All right, so I just tested my setup out. Works great. I'm picking up stuff on the 2-meter radio that's 50-60 miles away, which I never come close to with my handheld, even standing out in the deck where I've got a good view of the world. So, you know, I fired it up. If I'm outside on the porch with my handheld, I'll get 1 or 2 APRS stations. If you know what that means. If you don't, just think of it as a benchmark of how well that I'm receiving a signal. Firing up my car, sitting in the driveway, doing nothing special. I got, you know, 5 or 6 within the first 5 minutes. So far, pretty stoked about the setup. Things I would change or do differently. Again, I get those longer cords. I'm going to try and link to a amplifier kit that has the longer power cords. That should help out a bit. Other than that, just waiting for a few more parts. I'm waiting for a extension cable for the amateur radio microphone and a little cup holder mount, so I'll put some video into those once they arrive and I get them installed. And I'll see how the stashing the mics in that bin works. If it doesn't work that well, I may magnet mount them somewhere or put a little clip mount or something, just so they're out of the way but also easy to find and easy to reach. So pretty happy with the setup. If you've got a similar setup, you know, go ahead and throw something in the comments if you've done something creative, particularly with the new F-150, and maybe I'll chat with you out on the road. So 10-4 good buddies, peace on the streets, and talk to you soon.